Well, one of Kofi Annan's schoolmates at the Infantivim School has also been sharing his fond memories with Daniel Dazi.
The legacy that he has left for global diplomacy, collaboration, working together, the lessons that we as Ghanaians must learn from his life and from his sayings, his devotion to the encouragement of young people. These are the things that I would most remember him for, about being personal friends, that he was this extraordinarily great man, but he cared so much for the underprivileged. He cared so much about young people being given the opportunity to contribute to the development of their own societies and so on and so forth. I hope and I pray that as fellow Ghanaians, we would respect this legacy, that we would try to do some of the things that he has urged not only us but the rest of the world to do. Let's trust young people, let's invest in young people. Those were his words. I think if we can do that, we will be paying a great tribute to him. A tribute to him, in my view, is not necessarily in march past and those outward things, but adhering to some of his wise words about leadership, what leadership is about. I think he has said it so clearly about what the quality of leadership that is needed, particularly in Africa and in our own country. And I think that the greatest tribute we can pay to him is to take those words to heart and implement some of those.
If you were to choose, if he were to choose, do you think that this is the kind of tribute that he would ask to be made of him, to him?
I do. I do. He would not, in my view, be the one who wants a big military parade and all those things and so on and so forth. Because as I said, he always had this quiet dignity about him, not the flamboyant, demonstrative and so on and so forth. That would not be in the nature of the man. That's why I say that the best tribute we can pay to him is to do what he has advised us to do.
In the meantime, a former policy advisor who is also Director of Communications for Kofi Annan whilst he was at the UN has been throwing some light on what the former UN General Secretary was suffering from. Edward Mortimer has been sharing his memories as well.
I saw him only a couple of months ago and he seemed in very good health. I gather he was only taken ill about 2 weeks ago with pneumonia, and turned out that he had a very aggressive leukemia which has carried him off very, very quickly, and neither his family nor anyone else, I think, really had the time to prepare themselves for this very, very great loss. He was an extraordinarily self-controlled, one might say a centered person, I think. I never saw him lose his temper. I never heard him raise his voice. If he was unhappy or uncomfortable, he would just get even quieter. You had a sort of sense of him withdrawing into himself. But he knew very well that as a diplomat, and particularly working for the United Nations, you don't achieve results by shouting at people. His achievements, well, I think there are many. I mean, there's one I particularly like to remind people of, which is when he brought together the leaders of all the big pharmaceutical companies and persuaded them to agree to reduce the price of antiretroviral drugs in poor countries. And this, I think, has enabled many people living with HIV and AIDS to survive. And I think probably thousands of people, at least in Africa, are alive today who would not be if he hadn't done that. So that's one. I wouldn't say it's a small example, but it's a very specific example. Of course, other things, a lot of diplomacy is about preventing conflict, but the conflicts you hear about are the ones which were not prevented. I think another achievement was there could very easily have been a war between Nigeria and Cameroon over the Bokassi Peninsula. I don't think more than a handful of people in the world today have heard of the Bokassi Peninsula, but were it not for Kofi Annan's very patient efforts in bringing the leaders of those countries together and helping them find a solution which saved face for both of them, we might have heard as much about Bokassi as we've heard about places that caused the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea and other parts of the world. So I think those are things to bear in mind.
Edward Mortimer is a former policy advisor and as well as the director of communications for Mr. Kofi Annan. They're speaking with our partners, the BBC. In the meantime, here is how the BBC captures Mr. Annan's life at the UN.
I, Kofi Annan.
I, Kofi Annan.
Solemnly swear.
Solemnly swear.
Kofi Annan was sworn in as head of the United Nations in December 1996, the first black African to become UN Secretary General and the first to be appointed from within the organization. During his 2 terms in office, he used his position as one of the world's top diplomats to try to mediate in many different international crises. For him, the focus was always on the issues.
Leadership is not about the individual. When you have macho leaders who believe they have to shine and it all has to be about them, forgetting that what is required is the welfare of society and the people they serve.
Within 5 years of taking office, he'd been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for revitalizing the UN and for putting an emphasis on human rights. After 10 years as Secretary General, Mr. Annan had no thoughts of stepping out of the limelight, instead taking on other global roles, including becoming UN and Arab League Special Envoy to Syria, trying to end the civil war there. Already there have been many tributes from around the world for a leading diplomat who will be greatly missed.
That's how the BBC report captures the life of Mr. Kofi Annan at the United Nations.